All right, Chapter 3, Evolution, Biodiversity, Population Ecology. This is part of Unit 2. Unit 2 goes through Chapters 3, 4, and 5. A lot of this material should be reviewed from your biology. Some of it you're going to need to refresh. This is a big core basis for this class, so make sure that you do have an understanding of this material. Don't just skim through this chapter, make sure you do read it. Know the differences between species and population. So a species is any organism that's able to mate and create viable offspring. And a population is a group of species that live in an area together. So the bunnies in your backyard can breed with each other and make baby bunnies. And all of the bunnies that live in your neighborhood are a population of bunnies in Vernon Hills. Okay. So natural selection, if you don't remember again, is survival of the fittest. Those with the traits that are favorable for that habitat will survive and pass on their genetics, have children. Those that don't have the favorable traits will die and hopefully won't really pass on the genes onto the next generation. So when we look at natural selection, we talk about individuals being selected for or selected against. If an individual is selected for, their traits are good for that environment and they should survive. If they're being selected against, the traits are not favorable for that environment and they will die. So if we take a look at this population, we see a higher number of individuals with a medium beak length. They are being selected for, while the individuals with short or long beaks are actually being selected against, and that's why the numbers are changing. So environmental changes, sudden or gradual, typically they're slower, they do threaten species survival. If something comes in and changes, you either are going to change your behavior, you're going to leave that environment, or you're going to die. If you have an adaptation that is favorable for that environment, then you will survive and we'll start to actually see changes in the genetic gene pool over time. So don't forget the differences between adaptations and mutations and everything else. An adaptation is a trait that works for that environment. Your ability to blend in the rainforest, the adaptation would be the green skin. This isn't a verb. You can't just choose to be taller or choose to be green. You either have the trait and you will survive, or you don't have the trait. Remember, Darwin was pretty blunt about it. Some will die, some will live. Now, how does adaptation occur? How does natural selection occur? It all has to do with mutations. Remember, mutations aren't always bad. Some lead to adaptations that actually will allow you to survive better. Maybe if somebody grew wings, in their adaptation, they had a random mutation to grow wings, they would be more favored in a particular environment that, walking can occur. Okay, so we know a little bit more about that. So natural selection occurs when pretty much nature is deciding the factors. There are, let's go back, different types of selections. Look these over if you don't remember them. But inside here, you're going to see them explained a little bit more between directional, stabilizing, and everything else. When nature's not helping out and humans might be, we call that artificial selection. This is when we take it into our hands and choose which traits are favorable and what traits we actually want to survive and be passed on. We do this with crops. We've done this with cows and horses and dogs. We really, really like this Chihuahua, and we really like this, feature of a poodle. So we're going to combine the two of them genetically by breeding them and create the ideal dog. Or with racehorses. We see that horses, if they win the Triple Crown, they will then just quit racing and be bred constantly for those quick genes to be passed on. And that's considered to be artificial selection. We've done it with plants as well throughout time. Biodiversity. Make sure you understand the importance of biodiversity in the variety of life. Bio, again, meaning life, diversity meaning a lot of different things. So genetics has actually helped with this process. It's created a variety of life. If everybody was all the same, everything was all the same, one disease, one event could wipe us all out. Biodiversity is really important. Clearly, the dinosaurs were not capable of surviving, but the alligators and the crocodiles had the advantage and had some sort of adaptation that allowed them to survive that mass extinction. Okay. Speciation. When you guys took biology class, you guys learned this with the rock pocket mice and maybe the squirrels in the Grand Canyon. So this is speciation again. We call this allopatric speciation, which is typically seen when there's some sort of physical separation, glacier, mountain range, river, lava flow in this case, divides two populations. So if you take a look up here, we have one species of a population living all together. Then this lava flow came in and separated them to a greater distance that they couldn't fly from one location to the next. Because of that, this island continued to breed amongst themselves. So they had their own gene pool. Same thing was going on here. Over a lot of time, these guys kept breeding and breeding and breeding. These guys kept breeding and breeding and breeding. And they actually start to become their own species. Because if they reunite again, they have no interest in each other. They can't breed with each other anymore. This happens in your backyard. You have a lot of different species of birds in your backyard. Each of them has their own mating rituals, their own language, their own color, their own habitat, maybe where they live in the trees, type of nest they build, their own food source. They don't talk to each other, they don't breed with each other. They're their own separate species. And this is actually how species start to be created. Okay. Endemic species are any species that's found only in one place on Earth. This is interesting, but at the same time, this is kind of sad. It leads more into extinction. If you only exist in one place, as soon as your habitat or your food source is gone, you're not going to exist anymore. So we see this with a couple of different organisms. The animals we see in the fossil record are extinct today, and there's actually been several mass extinctions that have occurred. 5 have occurred, actually. So we've gone through 5. The most famous one that you guys probably remember is the KT mass extinction, which was the one that took the dinosaurs. We've lost a lot of biodiversity in each one of these mass extinctions. The crazy thing is that we're currently in our 6th mass extinction. And this is a man-made one due to overhunting, habitat destruction, the introduction of invasive species that we have. We're hurting the environment with pollution of the air, water, and soil. So we're actually causing this last 6th mass extinction. Who knows? Could it be the one that destroys us? So we'll move into a few other things. You need to make sure that you understand the definition of ecology, what we're looking at here. And don't forget that you probably learned these before, but the levels of organization and their definitions. The key to this is to remember the difference between abiotic and biotic factors. Abiotic is anything that's not living: water, air, rocks, wind. The biotic things are the living items in that particular environment. So we can see that. Remember, we can go from small to big or big to small. But you've got your organisms, your population of those organisms, the community, which is all of the biotic things that organism lives with. And then when you include all the abiotic and the biotic together, you have your lovely ecosystem. And those ecosystems are important because they provide the needs for that organism. As well as the habitat. Habitat is your living and non-living things that you need in order to survive. And the role that you play in that organism or in that ecosystem or that habitat is called your niche. That's your job. So there are actually 2 types that we're going to look at here of species. There's a generalist species, and then there's also a specialist species. In order to understand this, you have to think again about your role. So a lion's role is a top predator. The bunny's role is to provide a food source for the lion and, be an herbivore, eat plants. So generalists are pretty interesting. Generalists can actually live in many different kinds of places. So think of things like a coyote. There's a lot of different environments that a coyote can live in. A specialist can only live in a few particular areas. So like a mountain lion. These have a tendency of becoming more likely to be extinct or endangered because as soon as their resource goes extinct, they can only live in one or two areas. They unfortunately go extinct. So specialist species are advantaged over generalists. They're actually advantaged in a different way. They can change their habitat. These guys are advantaged in the fact that they stay in a consistent habitat, but once their habitat has been destroyed, they're in trouble. A lot of times we look at some things as indicator species. So that's a plant or an animal that's present that can show us the quality of the ecosystem. If we start to see that frogs are dying off, we know that the water in that area is probably more heavily polluted. Or if certain birds aren't coming back every spring or aren't leaving, we start to see and question what's going on in that environment. Okay, you should know these types of distributions of populations, so make sure you review each of these and take a look at your images as well as the definitions that they have. Let's get these. Okay, growth. We're going to get a lot into population growth mathematics later, and a lot of you guys that are taking your history classes will be already perfectly well off with this. But there are two types of growth. There's exponential growth, which is unlimited and unhindered. It's usually a J shape. Nothing's really stopping it. And then there's something called logistic growth. Logistic growth kind of makes that S shape, and it's limited by factors as well as carrying capacity. So if we look up here, they actually give you a few of the factors. So exponential, logistic, at some point there's going to be something that's going to happen to the population that's going to limit it, whether that's predators starting to attack, the amount of food that's available because your population's getting too big, the amount of space that you have, or disease, and eventually at some point that's going to start to wipe out your population. The cool thing about carrying capacity, the maximum amount of a population an environment can sustain, so the amount of resources available, is that at some point you are going to, exceed the carrying capacity. When that happens, it's called overshoot. You've exceeded that, we start to see resources going away, famine, disease, conflict, maybe war, and the population will actually have a die-off. When they exceed their carrying capacity, we start to see significant amount of resource depletion, so that area might not be conducive anymore to a high population. So carrying capacity can actually fluctuate. Like years of drought, there might be less of the certain plant. Natural disasters in the area might cause less growth of trees if there's a forest fire. The cool thing is about limiting factors, they come in two different types. So there's density dependent and there's density independent, which can change carrying capacity. The independent are those that we really typically can't control. Storms, fires, heat, drought, that's going to change the area, change the amount of resources and the available land, and that's going to adjust how many individuals can live in that environment. Then there's density dependent, stuff like clean water, air, food, disease, territory size. Us as humans, we have a little bit more control in this. Other organisms typically don't. But we can do better at keeping our water clean, not polluting, growing more food, vaccinating, whatever. So when we take a look at this, we look at survivorship curves. Survivorship curves shows the relative rate of survival of an individual in a population. So there are three types. Type 1, these people tend to live young and live out their lives and will die when they're really old. This would be stuff like humans, apes, whales, top predators, large mammals. We typically make it a long way in our lifetime. Type 2 are anybody that's going to have an equal death rate whether they're old or young. And we typically see this in birds. It's pretty consistent. Young birds will die, old birds will die. Okay. Type 3, these guys, a lot of them are going to see a high death rate when they're young. And then if they survive their young years, they actually live pretty decently and will die later as well. These are your prey animals: plants, seeds, sea turtles. If they can survive getting off the beach and into the ocean, they're probably going to live 100 plus years. So in order to understand that, we need to know then the types of species. K-selected species are those that are larger. They have only a few offspring. They are going to take care of their kids. They have a longer lifespan. They reproduce maybe once or twice in their life, a little bit more. They are typically type 1 in the graph on the other page. Well, our selected species, they have a lot of kids at one time. They don't really take care of them at all. Mom and dad just have the kids leave. They mature at a quick young age and live a short amount of time. These are your prey species or your bugs and insects. They have a high biotic potential, so they're going to have a maximum amount of kids in a short period of time. And they typically are a type 3 on the survivorship curve. Natural selection usually favors them because they're actually able to reproduce so quickly that even if something was going to happen in the environment, some of them are going to survive, and then reproduce and continue on. The chances of extinction happening usually happen to K-selected species. And that is it for chapter 3.